In the Second World War, the Eastern Front was not only the theater of actions of large formations and tank battles. It was also a war of guerrilla and sabotage by Soviet partisans who fought in the deep and deserted territories of the occupied USSR. These were not merely guerrillas, they were participants in a grim and ruthless operation, the so-called Rail War. Welcome to Before Now. In today's video, we will look at the tactics the Soviet partisans adopted behind enemy lines. These strategies, as useful as they were in halting the German war engine, were cruel and included acts of espionage, camouflage, and plain savagery. Stay tuned until the end of the video to understand how the Soviet partisan war was part of the Soviet strategy and contributed significantly to the weakening of the Germans in the East. The Soviet partisans worked in the immense emptiness of no man's land, where the Germans were often scarce. These conditions, forests, swamps, and villages, where people are few and far between, provided the partisans with freedom of movement without coming across the Wehrmacht while performing their deadly operations. Since there was no German supervision, the partisans fully dominated the region. It was a free-for-all zone controlled by the partisans, who planned their fight against the intruders. Their main aim was to weaken the German war machine by focusing on the transport system, especially the rail, which was the backbone of the Wehrmacht supply system. Railways were crucial in the German military industry, as they mobilized troops, food, and other resources to the front line. The Soviet partisans understood this weakness and consequently devoted a great deal of their operations to rail disruption. They did so using everything from explosives to physically shoving the tracks with their bare hands. The partisans were not only able to achieve this by causing minor nuisances, but they were also able to stall major military operations, especially during important campaigns such as the Battle of Stalingrad. For instance, in 1942, partisan actions were to blame for the postponement of the Winter Storm operation, which aimed at breaking through to the trapped German forces in Stalingrad under the command of Field Marshal Heinrich von Manstein. Despite this, 1942 may not have seen an extensive disruption of German railways. German railways were quickly repaired, but the partisans' acts were a source of constant irritation to the German military, which always had to spend resources on repair and security. In order to achieve the best effect of their actions, the partisans did not attack just anyone. A training manual used in 1942 recommended that the railways should be sabotaged at places where repairs were most difficult, such as at curves, steep gradients, or on high earthworks. In these places, the Germans also faced difficulty in countering the losses they were suffering. When no explosives could be obtained, the partisans had to employ cruder means, such as pulling rail loose from their supports with ropes or telegraph wire. This tactic was highly effective, as it gave train drivers little time to respond before a derailment occurred. The partisans were not above using explosives. They also undertook mine warfare with the Germans. This is one of the reasons why the Germans built an additional wagon at the front of a train, hoping it would detonate a mine before the locomotive ran over it. The partisans quickly countered with pressure-sensitive mines that only exploded under the weight of larger trains, leaving the empty carriages intact. This forced the Germans to fill the empty wagons with rocks or gravel in an attempt to trigger the mines early. The partisans retaliated by placing strings of mines along the tracks, ensuring that at least one would destroy the locomotive. Once a train was overturned, partisan fighters advanced swiftly, sometimes in small groups, to attack the remaining German occupants with rifles, machine guns, and grenades. The goal was simple: kill the enemy, take whatever food and ammunition they had, and retreat before reinforcements could arrive. Time was always of the essence, as the Germans could mobilize very quickly to retake lost ground. The Soviet partisans' activities included not only the physical destruction of infrastructure, but also propaganda and camouflage. Partisans relied on surprise attacks, often capturing Germans while they were perplexed. This form of warfare involved a great deal of deception, with traps set to ensure the enemy fell into a state of disarray. Psychologically, the partisan movement far exceeded its actual accomplishments during the first winter of the war. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, the commander of Heeresgruppe Maid, reported, "The steady increase in numbers of enemy troops behind our front and the concomitant growth of the partisan movement in the entire rear area are taking such a threatening turn that I am compelled to point out this danger in all seriousness. Another particularly odious strategy was civilian cooperation. Partisans could be recruited by persuasion or force, threatening or even coercing local populations. They usually disguised themselves as friendly locals or used force to compel the peasants, who might have been indifferent or favorable towards the Germans. This camouflage enabled them to operate undercover and frequently unseen, and it also allowed them to set up a misguiding trail that would give the Germans a tour of the region. To counter this kind of deception, the Germans attempted to conduct massive anti-partisan operations. However, such attempts were frequently unfruitful, as the partisans had well-developed espionage and reconnaissance units. For this reason, the Germans found themselves on the defensive and often had to use up a lot of resources in a futile chase after ghosts. German response to the Soviet partisans was also brutal. The Wehrmacht and the SS used a tactic known as Bonderbekämpfung, or bandit fighting, during which any civilians suspected of assisting the partisans were killed. Whole populations were massacred. Women and children were hanged, shot, or burned alive. The purpose was to instill fear in the local people and discourage anyone else from supporting the partisans. Such actions, however, did not always hit the goal, and many of the killed civilians were not actually partisans. They were not combatants. Instead, they were ordinary citizens caught in the terrible action of the War of Nerves. A good example of this is the German operation in May 1943, called Operation Ziegerner Bären. In this operation, the Germans focused on a pocket of partisans to the south of Bryansk and cleared the area with vengeance. Though it is reported that they eliminated and arrested thousands of partisans, most of them were civilians. However, the Germans managed to wipe out 1,600 partisans. The rest of the partisan forces rejoined the area by the end of the summer and resumed operations. The German authorities punished every action severely, but the Soviet partisans did not surrender and became more numerous. One such story centered on a young girl named Zoya Kozmo-Demianskaya. Born in 1923, Zoya joined a partisan unit in the autumn of 1941. She quickly adapted to the rigors of partisan warfare, helping lay mines and performing reconnaissance work. In November, she volunteered to enter the village of Petriskivo, which had a German garrison, to perform reconnaissance and cause any damage she could. Zoya was captured a few days later and subjected to an interrogation that included severe beatings. According to a German sergeant who was present, the teenager remained silent during the entire process. Making no headway, the Germans marched her through the village, half naked, and hanged her. Zoya's mutilated body was left on the gallows for more than a month until the Red Army recaptured the village. At the end of 1943, the partisans had grown to between 150 to 250,000 personnel, from only a few thousand in 1941. At the same time, manpower increased not only in the number of recruits, but also in organization and leadership. Most of the partisans were drawn from the regular Red Army and thus possessed considerable fighting experience and strict military training. Soviet Central Headquarters in Moscow also started delivering more arms to the partisans so that they could mount more complicated and coordinated operations. During the summer of 1943, when the Soviet armed forces were concentrating on the Kursk operation, the partisans intensified their activities in preparation for the Soviet offensive. They launched a large-scale attack on German railway infrastructure to cut off logistical supplies, while denying the Germans the ability to shift troops to the front lines. These endeavors caused massive problems for the Germans, as the partisans were able to mount attacks 30 times more frequently than in previous months. The partisans of the Soviet Union fought ruthlessly, efficiently, and significantly for the Soviets' forces to win World War II. Through their continuous destruction of German property, especially the railways, they had a major influence on the Wehrmacht's war in the East. The partisans also significantly contributed to the final Soviet victory by cutting off supplies, delaying the German movement, and tying up the resources with anti-partisan missions. In conclusion, Soviet partisans were not only the occasional and random attack guerrilla fighters, but a highly trained and organized force to inflict the longest-range war of existence. Their strategy, while successful in crippling the German military, has proven to be extremely harsh and cruel. and that is why it is impossible to overestimate the role of the brutal nature of the struggle on the Eastern Front during World War II. This brings us to the end of the video. What do you think of the role of partisans in World War II? Which other piece of history do you want us to reveal? Leave your thoughts and answers in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to Before Now for more videos from us. See you next time.